is long, but it bends towards justice. Farmers have waited too long. Farmers are mostly women in Africa.
Yeah.
I think it's time to change the equation, and we should be guided by the fierce urgency of now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sir Hussein. So it's time to change the equation, and you've given us a couple of variables that we need to think about as we reconfigure that equation. And perhaps your starting point is interesting because I think it's going to spark quite a lot of debate on the app, because you say that aid done right works. And you go on to outline the poverty numbers as a way of indicating the size of the problem. And so almost challenging us to say, is there an ideological debate that we're having here versus a real need that still needs to be addressed on the ground? You talk about small but catalytic sums that can make a difference. You challenge us to stop just thinking at a level of partnerships, but we actually now need to think about synergies, because that's what's going to make the difference. And finally, you give us a recipe. You say there is a recipe, there is a way of getting it right. It's about priorities, plus participatory democracy, plus technology, and we actually could see a change. So ladies and gentlemen, those are the big ideas. We're going to park those ideas, and I think some of them will be challenged, and I think some of them will be reinforced. Allow me then to come to yourself, Graham, and maybe to get a sense from your perspective around how do we make food security and agriculture, leveraging maybe the recipe that we've heard here, as a driver of competitiveness on the continent, as the continent positions itself as an influential and strong player in the global market.
Sure, and thank you so much for inviting me to what is a very interesting conversation. Let me begin with the disclaimer which worried me when I was asked to speak on this panel, that I'm not an agriculturalist, I'm not an expert in any way in food security. But it also, one of my convictions after a fairly long career in development is that sectors are important. Having experts in certain areas is absolutely vital. But that's not always the answer to everything. People don't live their lives in sectors. Farmers have pretty much the same needs as I do for food, water, shelter, education for their children, health, and so on. So I'd like to feel that in some ways having a view that's not a technical view might be helpful to this conversation. On the technical front, and the gentleman, the more distinguished gentleman than I am who sat in this chair before me, pointed out that there's no shortage of food in the world. Right? we waste something like 1.3 billion tons of food every year. And I've no idea what 1.3 billion tons of food looks like, but it's a lot, right? And that's just wasted. 680 billion in the industrial world, and perhaps even more shockingly, 310 billion in the non-industrialized world. It's a huge amount of waste. So I don't think that, to link the conversation to the demographics, in 60 years' time, Africa might have 3.5 billion people, as opposed to 1.2, 1.3 billion now. I'm sure science and technology, notwithstanding climate change and many other challenges, will find a way to address that. But essentially, feeding people and enabling competitiveness is as much a political decision as it is one for technical experts in this field. And yes, 700 million people live in extreme poverty, and that's better than it was 30 years ago, but it's still absolutely outrageous that, in this day and age, in 2019, something between 700 and 800 billion people live on less than the cost of a cup of coffee that I just bought earlier. Specifically to how Africa can increase its competitiveness in this field, the first question which I'll raise, which I can't answer, is that the right question? Should Africa be more competitive in agriculture now than in the future? Does it actually matter if it manages to be competitive in the grand scheme of things, or should it try to be competitive in niche areas, and should it try to be competitive in areas where it has a comparative advantage? 60% or so of Africa are smallholder farmers, so it's a big deal. Something like 23% of GDP in Africa comes from, according to McKinsey, comes from agriculture. But only 6% of Africa's cultivated land is currently irrigated, which means that agriculture is very dependent on rain. And with climate change and so on, that's becoming a big issue. And indeed, climate change may give those countries in Western Europe and North America, which rely much more on irrigated crops, a bigger advantage over Africa than they currently have. FAO predicts, with climate change, that by 2080, so 60 years ahead from now, there'll be about an 8% increase in arid land, arid and semi-arid land in Africa. So that's also going to cause the continent a big challenge in terms of the land it has is gradually becoming less viable and and is producing less. So farmers in Africa are becoming perhaps more vulnerable.
Yeah.
So given all of this, and given my larger question about should Africa think about being more competitive or not, which I can't answer and will leave to others to decide, let me suggest some ways in which Africa might become more competitive in this field. The first is invest in infrastructure, and a lot of that's going on in the continent at the moment. If you look at some numbers from McKinsey, they suggested an $8 billion investment in storage, $65 billion investment in irrigation, $100 billion investment in roads and ports. Whether that, and that will certainly help those parts of African agriculture that seeks to become more competitive and seeks to export, and by export I don't just mean abroad, but also to the next town or to the big city. Secondly, and something that was discussed on the former panel again, is around human capacities. Somebody said, didn't they, that the education system we have today is really fit for the 20th century, but not really for the 21st century. What are the kind of capacities, what kind of knowledge, what kind of talents, what kinds of abilities do people being educated now need for the future? And that applies to people who are working in agriculture as much as it does in every other field. So there's infrastructure, there's the question of knowledge and attitudes in education. Thirdly, the cost of doing business is very high in this part of the world. It's coming down in some areas. The cost of doing business and the cost of farming inputs, power in particular, is a serious issue. So again, to become more competitive, let's look at the price of those inputs and find ways of reducing it. I think fourthly, and an area which I think is something that's going to occupy a lot of this discussion and a lot of discussions over the next 60 years, is the spread of technology. I mean, who would have guessed, when I was a student 30 years ago, who would have guessed the enormous changes that have happened in those up to today? And now with the so-called fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, blockchain, drones playing a huge role in food aid in fragile states now, the Internet of Things. Where is all that going in 10, 20, 60 years' time? I have no idea, but we know that we're now on the fourth industrial revolution. They're coming more and more quickly. By 2080, we'll probably be on the sixth, seventh, eighth industrial revolution. Who knows what that will bring? We already have 3D food.
Yeah.
It's not very nice, it's not very good for you, but plenty of room for progress there, plenty of room. Maybe in 80 years' time we'll all just be taking a pill and not sitting down to lunch. Who knows? But there's lots of, and I think that, as people discussed earlier, Africa really can play a very key role in leapfrogging some of these technologies that other more economically advanced countries and continents cannot do so quickly and so rapidly and not be so agile. Two more quick things, if I may. Fifthly, green, go green. There's a lot of emphasis, increasing emphasis from consumers, not just in the West, but also increasingly in the growing middle class in Africa on green products. knowing the origin of the products, where they come from, who produces them. You know, you think of niche projects, like niche products like coffee, for example, like tea, all those kinds of things. And how, in that green economy, we create some sort of circular economy, which integrates food safety management from the farm to the table, and something that's very visible by consumers. So consumers can sit on their iPads and see that whole chain. So my really big idea is perhaps that Africa does not need to be food competitive. It needs to feed itself. I have no doubt that it has the capacity to feed itself. We need to stop wasting food. That's the first absolute thing. And I'm sure technology and I'm sure agricultural experts will take care of the necessary skills and abilities to make sure that there's enough food to eat.
So, ladies and gentlemen, some controversial insights. Maybe we are focusing on the wrong thing. Maybe it isn't about being competitive in agriculture. And maybe there are a couple of things we need to be thinking about, like how are we investing in agricultural infrastructure, the extent to which we're investing in human capital, the extent to which we're creating a conducive business environment, the extent to which we're leveraging technology, and the extent to which we're looking at the going green movement and the circular economy on the back of that, and the power that gives consumers to trace along the value chain the origin and the journey of the products that they consume. And a challenge for all of us sitting in the room to say, how much food have you wasted today? So I'm going to leave that there to sit with us as we engage with it. And I maybe would love to come next to Madame Catherine, who is Executive Director for the African Population and Health Center, coming in from Uganda. And the question, the big broad frame that I'd love for you to speak to, Catherine, is the nexus where food meets population, and why we're having this conversation about 1 billion African mouths and why that matters. So your thoughts on that?
Thank you for having me. My thoughts actually maybe could also be considered a little bit controversial. And I think when you talk about feeding Africans, there's been a dominant narrative. And that narrative has been a narrative of scarcity and undernutrition. But this narrative also is in a bigger, I would say, global context, whereby there's a feeling that there's no limit to how the population can grow, and there's no limit to how healthy the global population can be, and that the world has infinite resources to accommodate all the advances in health that have led to people living longer and all that. So there's a dominant thinking that somehow as a race or as a species, we can be healthy, have enough food, grow in the same planet, that the planet has infinite resources to support all that. So I think these two narratives, there are some reality checks that somehow need to counter these narratives. And I think before we think about who is going to feed the 1 billion Africans, we need to think about what are we feeding them to begin with, and why are we feeding them? Not why because you want them to die, but what is driving the narrative about feeding Africa's billions? So the first reality check is the nutrition transition, whereby now many African countries are grappling with as much overnutrition as they're grappling with undernutrition. So when you talk about feeding Africa's billions, I think we need to strike a balance between the fact that, yes, we need to feed those who don't have, but also we need to figure out what about those who are having too much of the wrong thing. So the consequence of this transition is that there are countries which are grappling with a threefold increase in obesity rates over the last 25 years, threefold increase. There are countries whereby maybe a quarter of the adult population is obese. And in the same countries, maybe a quarter of the population is, undernourished. Yeah. So I think my premise is that, my proposal is that as we talk about feeding, we should have this balance, not a narrative that is dominated by scarcity and undernutrition, when in actual fact, the reality is different. I think the second reality check is what happens when food production meets environmental sustainability. And I think Graham alluded to that and said, in spite of climate change, things might happen. And I think I would say, no, because of climate change, things are not going to happen. Because if you look at the contribution of food production to the environmental degradation, so food production is both a driver and a victim, actually, of environmental changes. And I don't think we can keep on pretending that we must produce food at all costs. So some numbers here. 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions come from food production. And livestock accounts for about half of that. So about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from livestock. Food production occupies about 40% of global land and uses 70% of fresh water, and is the largest driver of extinction of species. Food production has resulted in the reduction of wild fish stocks, and so far only about 70% of fishing areas are considered to be underfished. 93% are either moderately or overfished. So, as I've said earlier, agriculture is both a victim and a perpetrator of shifting environmental conditions. And as we think about feeding Africa's billions, I don't think we can keep into this feed people at all costs.
Yeah.
So we need to strike a balance between population growth, health and well-being, food production, while at the same time safeguarding the planet. And I think we need to question the infinity mindset, that somehow we must eat at all costs, and we must eat even though eating kills us in the process.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've noticed there's a shift in the chairs when some hard truths are landing from the panel. The first shift I saw was when Graham suggested that we might all just take a pill in the next couple of years, and I saw some looks exchanging. But also, you've dropped some really difficult truths for us in those insights, and I can see it in the change of the body language of the audience. And what you're challenging us to do, you're saying there's some reality checks. We need to check the narrative. For too long, we're perpetuating a narrative that actually isn't nuanced. And when we get into the core of the narrative, there's some big questions we need to be asking ourselves, including the balance of overnutrition as well as undernutrition. Now, I'm mindful that my phone is going crazy because of all the questions. But before I get to the questions, I do want to come to you, Madame Jackie. You've listened to a range of views, a range of controversial views on this particular topic. I'd love you to weigh in on your big picture thoughts on feeding Africa's billions.
Okay. So I'll start it like this. I am a daughter of an Anglican priest, now retired. And I know that many times we would have gone hungry if it wasn't for people, the parishioners, feeding us. I also know that one of the things that I was taught in my father's household is that your house remains open at all times for anyone who comes in, and they must find something to eat or drink. I know that food is a central part of the way we give and live as Africans. And so food as part of the way we do our philanthropy is very key. I think there's enough food to go around, and I think each of us can attest to either having fed or being fed by somebody. I think what we don't see enough of is the proper counting of the ways that Africans give. And that when not counted right, you get narratives like the ones we are contending with today. And I think that if we counted food as part of the ways that we do philanthropy in Africa, and actually quantified it, but also quantified it in a way that allows us to track it. So who is giving food? How is it being given? To whom? And when tracked right, we would be able to then say who is not getting food, so that we can encourage all the givers to give to those sections, those sectors that are not getting fed enough. And that's how I think we can harness the power and potential of African philanthropy in the area of food and agriculture. And unfed people are voiceless, they are not dignified, and they are not self-reliant. And so the promise, the power, and the potential in African philanthropy is precisely to return those things to us, to return our dignity, our voice, and our self-reliance.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we live as Africans where it comes naturally for us to give, and food is one of the ways we know of giving, have we missed the opportunity to quantify this form of philanthropy even amongst ourselves? And if we quantified it and if we measured it, what would it reveal to us? And if we did it right, could we give back voice, give back dignity, and give back self-reliance? I'm going to open up the floor. There are a series of questions, and the way I'm going to do it is that I'm going to go with the questions that are the most popular. Remember that as you post your questions, you can see everybody else's questions, and you can like a question, which then automatically pulls it up as a popular question for me, and that gives me an indication of the question that the audience really wants us to have a go at. So, I'm going to go with the most popular question, which comes from Andrew Musoke, and Andrew is saying, Madam Karusisi, how can we use technology to make smallholder farmers less risky and more attractive for bank microloans? And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask my panelists to be sharp and short and concise so that I can get as many questions from you as possible. Over to you.
Thank you. Very, very good question, and this has been at the heart of what we are trying to do at Bank of Kigali, but I guess in many banks and other institutions across the continent. So it's right, investment needs to be done at the farms level, and in this case, in the case of Africa, we speak about smallholder farmers. So we know these smallholder farmers, small farms, the women farmers on the continent, contribute 80% of food supply. The food we have on our tables, on our plates, is contributed by a smallholder farmer, the majority of it. But again, going back by what my colleague here was saying, the smallholder farmer is the most likely to be poor, to go hungry. Yet these are the very people who are feeding, us, urban people, etc. So there's something that needs to be done at that level if we are really to transform agriculture, but also to lift all these people out of poverty. Now, I think the issue and the challenge has been that in the past, giving access to these smallholder farmers, they constitute about 30 million. In Africa, it's very many. In Rwanda, we have about 2.5 million farmers.
Yeah. Giving
these people access to finance has been very difficult. But today we have technology solutions that can offer not only payment platforms, they can offer credit platforms, they can offer digital insurance that help us to access the very small farmer at pretty much zero cost. For today, let me give you an example of what we've been doing at Bank of Kigali, but it's not only us, we've been working as a partnership with the government of Rwanda and many other partners, including AGRA. So we developed a platform to register all the smallholder farmers. We have about 2 million of these people registered on the platform. It is a digital platform. We got information on who they are, their mobile phones, the seeds they use, the kind of fertilizers, and even a lot of social demographic information. So we got all this information. We know exactly, the size of their land, etc. So this created the foundation for us to be able to develop many other solutions. So we've now, on top of that platform, created a payment platform.
Yeah.
So we want to help these farmers buy get the subsidies from government. They get subsidies for inputs. We also want to be able to give them credit that will help them improve their practices, improve their yields, etc. So this has been very critical. And on top of this platform, we can only imagine the number of solutions that we can address to these people. So we have this platform. It is called Smart Hunganire. Hunganire was the subsidy platform of the government that we made smart. And now everyone can give them access to, practice. They can receive education on their phone. They can receive advice on their phones every day. People can be able to give them that information. And what we have now, we have about 250,000 of these farmers who have a mobile wallet designed by Bank of Kigali, but specifically designed for farmers. So it helps them to pay for their inputs, buy fertilizers, buy seeds. But the next product we are going to develop is a credit product, specifically to improve the access to seeds and the right seeds and fertilizers, because we want them to improve their yields. Thank you.
So thank you for sharing that live case study of work that the bank is already doing, but also giving an indication of how you're going to be building on the platform so that even the accessing of credit becomes easier. And in the context of the future, these are the kind of conversations that we need to be also asking, how do we scale this and make it beyond just the Bank of Kigali, but an Africa-wide opportunity? I'm going to ask you to be very brief, Mr. Hussein. There's a question here that comes from Al-Kags, and Al-Kags says, how could we fire up African-led cutting-edge research and development on agriculture and food production? Much of it is being done by foreign researchers. So how do we build our own capability so that we can really research agriculture and what is possible instead of relying on foreign intellect and foreign insights to come and frame the challenges and the opportunities for us?
Thank you very much. I think the questioner has hit the pulse of the issue. The generation of new technologies, I've had the privilege of working for nearly 40 years with the consultative group on international agricultural research, which was the creator of the Green Revolution. Well, that was the Green Revolution bypassed Africa almost entirely. The spate of new technologies and the high-yielding varieties and so forth just, were concentrated largely in Asia and in Latin America. I mean, we now have new institutions, AGRA, and so much more that are sort of bringing the new technologies to Africa. The key is, I think, investment in research and development.
Yeah.
And that is not something that can be outsourced. A key part of the solution will be for Africans and African governments to step up research and development. This cannot be outsourced. There's much virtue in terms of having research collaboration. The Green Revolution has shown that.
Yeah.
We also know, and I do want to make this point, that one of the big debates about the Green Revolution is how it bypassed small farmers in the early stages. We do know from the long history that technology is not scale or effect neutral.
Yeah.
It is elites that benefit first because they derive the most benefits. But there are no universal solutions.
Yeah.
But there are universal processes. Transparency, accountability, participation, all of that, which can pave the way for local solutions. And I think it's that new partnership that has to come together between scientists, between communities, between farmers, listening to farmers, and getting technology to respond to their needs.
So we need to rethink the way we outsource research and development as a starting point. So I want to quickly come to some burning questions that are coming here. Graham, there's a question from you here. It comes from Furanzima Fred, and he says, Graham, what do you think about the growing gap between rural and cities development in Africa, and what seems as taking out poor people in the cities and unemployment, and how this relates to food security? It's a big question.
That's several PhDs on that one. But, I mean, clearly the problem is growing. More and more Africans, just as more and more Asians, more and more everybody is moving into cities. So I think we're almost at the tipping point in Africa where more people will live in cities. I was looking at some numbers for 2080. 6 of the world's 10 megacities will be here in Africa. So clearly people are moving away for opportunities, for jobs, if they're there, for Juakali work, whatever it is. And we talked earlier about the youth bulge, which is obviously part of this. Farming isn't particularly cool. I don't know many young people who really want to stay in a village and work on a farm. So how do we find some ways of making that more or less attractive? If you look at solutions in the more developed world, then city farms are becoming a major source of nutrition in some parts of the world. There's a lot of work to be done on that, but that's a possibility. But clearly, carrying on with the sort of traditional agriculture that we have today in much of the world is not going to, the yield has to be much, much higher.
Yeah.
All the evidence we have suggests that fewer and fewer people will be required to produce more and more yield. So that's also something that we have to take into account. There'll be fewer jobs at the raw end of farming, at the digging end of farming. So I think it's something that's part of an inevitable trend, and thought leaders, politicians have to respond to that trend and work out, and it's everything from designing cities in which people can move easily, designing cities in which people can have access to food, and ensuring some kind of supply chain into the city. But it's a huge challenge for political leaders and thought leaders over the next 60 years.
So quickly, just before, I've got a question for Madame Catherine, and I literally want a 10-second response on this one, Graham. It's not a PhD question, it's really a 10-second response. Bhavesh Chandaria is saying, what about if we leased farming land to densely populated countries like China and India, and in turn keep 10 to 20% charge on the food that we have produced? I love the thinking that's coming in this question. It's forward thinking. It's the next 60 years kind of thinking. You spoke about competitiveness. Does this sound like something we could do as Africans?
It's done already. China, Saudi Arabia already lease a lot of land in Africa to feed their own populations. It's part of a solution, yes.
Absolutely yes is the response. It's part of the solution. Marilyn has a question for you, Catherine. And Marilyn's saying, what investments can be made to better coordinate production and supply of food, to better manage wastage, and to ensure that food is delivered where it is needed? Back to linking to the point of supply chain that Graham has just raised.
I think the issue of food wastage is fundamental to the future of feeding Africans. Partly because it deals with the sustainability issues and also deals with the scarcity issues. So there are different things that we have to look at. But I'll go back to my earlier point that even as we think about wastage, it is wastage of what? And Africa needs to invest as much in high-quality, nutritious food as it invests in any food. So I think the biggest needs really are around wastage of fruits and vegetables. Yeah. Because when you think about healthy diets, really that's where the most investment should go to increase the access to fruits and vegetables by a much greater percentage than there. Yeah. So issues around preservation, issues around repurposing, issues around different ways of consumption, because in our traditional African societies, we consume mangoes perhaps the same way. And perhaps they can be consumed in many different ways. Yeah. So we need to repurpose, we need to rethink different ways of consumption, but also focus a lot around preservation.
Before I move on from you very quickly, to Catherine, what's your take on what's your take on genetically modified foods and feeds for Africa? You've just spoken that you've just said that we have a very particular way of consumption. Are we open to genetically modified foods? Graham planted the idea for us that he says it doesn't taste too great. Do you think that this could be the next wave in Africa? Or a sustained wave, rather?
That's one of those hot button topics. And depending on which side of the aisle you are, my own personal view is that I don't think perhaps even those that oppose genetically modified foods actually consuming them without knowing. So I think as a researcher, I think I'm persuaded that they are safe, and that with the right safeguards around diversity, and it's a learning process. There are some which have been maybe disastrous, but I don't think all GMOs have been disastrous. And I think maybe better GMOs or better ways of looking at how to modify there's biofortification, there are different ways. So I think there's a whole range of options that are still on the table. And it's a question of if they were initially bad, maybe how do we make them better?
Yeah.
So I think they still have a role to play, because I don't think what needs to be done to transform the food landscape in Africa requires all the tools that we can get.
All right, Madam Jackie, there's a question that comes back to the point that you made about us as Africans. And this question is anonymous. And the question is, Africans have a cultural relationship with their food. As we look to raise in production, how can we maintain our unique and cultural relationship with food?
Wow. Another PhD. Anyhow, so the first thought that jumped to my mind, and I think this culture is common across Africa, is in rainy seasons, we help each other grow food. A community will come together and give their labor to one farmer, will help that farmer farm their land for 1, 2, 3 days, then move on to another. And I think through that way, they're both supporting food security, as well as, in my view, passing on the culture of we give labor, we give time, we give knowledge. Because in helping that farmer, the discussions that are going on are, and this is the best way to grow this, and this is how we preserve this when we harvest it, and this is the market that I've heard for this kind of product. And so I think even in those very practices of the way we do philanthropy around food can be part of the ways we embed culture. But I think, and then the other end of that I can think of is food as part of our art form. And I know that there's a lot of thinking about how to preserve and expose and showcase African art. And African food is integral, I believe, to African art. And I think that is another way that one can embed culture around food, around art, around culture.
All right, so we have an opportunity here to close this conversation in a fun way. And what we're going to do is, instead of giving every panelist an opportunity to make a closing statement, because I could say, let's do a closing statement for 1 minute, and then all my panelists will take 5 minutes. And what's likely to happen is that we're going to lose the time that we've made up. So we're back on time, back on track. And what I'd love for us to do, and I'm getting a sign from my friend there, he's saying, you've got 10 more minutes? Okay, so I'm going to park my fun trick. I'm going to put it in my back pocket, because we're still going to do it. So you haven't been saved. What has happened, though, is that you've just earned yourself 2 minutes to make a closing remark. And in your closing remark, I'd love for you to focus on the so what. We've had a conversation here that has been highly controversial. We've dropped some insights, some challenges. We've forced a rethink. We've said there's some reality checks that need to come into play. There's a narrative that needs to change. So what? What do we take out of this conversation that is going to be definitively defining in the next 60 years when we think about food security on the African continent? And I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I'm going to be very strict about that 2 minutes, because it's going to get us to our 10 minutes. Now, Mr. Hussein is already looking at me saying, pick me. I'm ready to go. So I'm going to go to you first, sir. In 2 minutes, your one big idea of how we make this conversation count for Africa's next 60 years in food security.
My time begins now. I've looked at the crystal ball. I'm looking at an Africa in 60 years from now. It's the mother continent. It's a role that needs to be reinforced. Africa will make quantum strides in improving food and agriculture. Why it should need to do that is very clear. A small country like Thailand today exports more food than all of sub-Saharan Africa combined. That has to change. The other thing that is going for Africa in the food and agriculture sector is that food markets are exploding. There's roughly about $313 billion today. By 2030, there's a $1 trillion market opportunity waiting to be grasped. That is huge. And that's only by 2030. We're looking at a longer time frame in terms of 60 years.
Yeah.
So that number could very well double. The opportunities are boundless. Africa is home to the largest tracts of fertile land that has not yet been brought under the plow. 200 million hectares and more. The flip side is that 90% of that land is undocumented, which leads to the headlines about land grabs and so forth. We have new technologies that are coming on stream, artificial intelligence, blockchain, CRISPR, as I mentioned, quantum computing. All of these need to be marshaled to improve the productivity, the profitability, and the sustainability of African agriculture. The next generation of climate-smart technologies in agriculture, they will have to be more productive, with greater resilience and fewer emissions. One of my panelists talked about agriculture contributing up to 25 to 30% of greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
Right? So that will have to, and most importantly, these climate-smart technologies will have to have a Made in Africa label, because they will be particularly suited to the diverse ecologies of the continent.
Yeah.
Blockchain technologies offer huge potential with immutability at their core. They will need to be marshaled for the next generation of land registries so that we don't have these headlines of land grabs. The land registries of the future will have to respect traditional land rights.
Yeah.
They will also have to truly empower African farmers. I think if these steps were taken, Africa would arrive as the next agribusiness giant. It would also help feed the world and banish hunger in our lifetime. Such innovations are needed. These might also help end the drought about Nobel Prizes being given to Africans.
Yeah.
The next generation of researchers will have to be a woman. After all, Rwanda has shown us the way about women's leadership. And the next African scientist would be a woman, and she would earn the Nobel Prize, just like Norman Borlaug did it in 1970.
I think there's a round of applause coming for you from the women in the room.
And finally, Africa would have arrived on the global stage as a source of ideas, as a source of innovation, as a source of institutions that, together with responsive governments, will serve as a lodestar for the rest of humanity. Okay. Yes, friends, with bold ideas and action, Africa can. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Africa can. There's $1 trillion market that is waiting for us as close as 2030. We need to be deliberate about documenting our land. We need to harness the power of technology for production and sustainability. Made in Africa needs to be the new sexy tag on every single product that has ecological context for us. We have to be careful and clear about how we handle land registries of the future, because there are traditional insights that are important for us. And Africa can, as a resounding call to action. Let me come to you, Diane, next. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. What can we do definitively today that is going to shape the future of food security in Africa in the next 60 years?
Thank you. I'll come back to the statistics you gave when we started this panel. 35 billion spent on imports on an annual basis. And I have another statistic. 11 billion needed of investment into agriculture on an annual basis if we are to attain the required expansion of agriculture and to feed our people. I think this is a very obvious equation. We are spending on an annual basis 35 billion to import food. We have the most of arable land, this was said, and we only need 11 billion of investment, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, to expand and transform our agricultural sector. So from where I sit, I would say, and I wanted to disagree with the question about leasing our lands to Chinese, or I disagree with that completely. I think when I think about the 11 billion needed to invest in the agricultural sector, first of all, where does it come from? I think it should come from Africans, from ourselves, from our savings, from our governments, And I don't think it's something we should just outsource, because we relate as Africans very differently to the lands we have, to the food we eat. The relationship is different. And we need to find, I think our farmers need to find meaning in farming, not only feeding people and getting food on the table. They really need to find meaning and dignity and everything my colleague talked about. I like it very much. So we need to invest in agriculture. Ourselves, we need to find the right solutions. The good thing is technology is universal. Now we all have access to technology, but we have to make it tailor-made because our farmers, again, are different. They have different levels of education. We need to find the right solutions that are tailor-made and, that are adjusted to our needs on the continent. Yeah. And I'm sure with that, we'll be able to not only feed ourselves, have the quantity, the quality, and taking account of the sustainability, but we will also be able to feed the world. Thank you.
So it's a simple maths equation. 35 billion to import, 11 billion needed in investment. If we did the maths and allocated the investments in the right place, we could change the future of food security on the continent in the next 60 years. Thank you very much for that, Diane. Catherine, what do we do? Jackie, my apologies. Jackie, what do we do today that's going to have a definitive difference in the next 60 years in 2 minutes?
So it's harnessing African giving to solve African problems. If you think with me about all the Rotary clubs across this continent, all the cooperative societies across this continent, all the churches across this continent, all the companies doing CSR, there's so much giving that is happening every day of our lives. The issue is we don't know how much it is. We don't even know exactly in which sectors it is in order to redirect giving to the places that need it most. Mm-hmm. So I think if we count our giving and count it right and mark the trends and know the givers, we can then channel it to the sectors like food that are part of our sustainability.
Okay, so we need to harness the power of giving as Africans. If we do that today, and back to your earlier points, quantified it, measured it, we might have a different picture emerging. Okay, so let me move on then to Diane. I've got my names mixed up now. To Catherine, yes, sorry.
So I think my last thought would be that on one side of an equation, we need to have quantity of food, quality of food, safety of food. And on the other side of that equation, we have sustainability. And the 65% of arable land in the land being in Africa is a new statistic to me. What I knew is that globally 40% of land is arable, and that there's beyond 50% of that land being arable, there's actually a danger of the whole ecosystem breaking up. So as Africans, I would say it's a gift that we have to the world. And if I had an infinity mindset, it would be like, okay, how do we maximize this and produce more food, to feed the world? But I don't want an infinity mindset. And it's a question of how do we maximize a little bit of that. So we get the 50% limit that has been deemed to be quite dangerous if we exceed that. How do we maximize that small portion to focus on food that is healthy, but is also sustainable? Because there's food that is both unhealthy and unsustainable. And so I think it would be a shame if that proportion of arable land was used for things that are actually going to kill us when we eat them, while destroying the environment in the same, in the same breath. So that as Africans, we can sit down and say, okay, this is our bargaining chip to the world. We can save the world, but this is what we want in return. All these investments in technology, in new ways of production, let's focus them on things that are actually going to improve our health, while protecting the land for us, but also protecting the whole global ecosystem on which we depend as a species. 60 years from now, with an infinity mindset, I don't think there will be anyone to talk about food production. So we are going to eat ourselves and the world to death.
Ladies and gentlemen, the warning is so loud and clear. If we don't do things differently, if we don't do differently, be differently, think differently, eat differently, we're going to eat ourselves to death. And the underlying themes there, quantity, quality, safety, sustainability. Graham, in your final 2 minutes, what do we do to definitively different from today that's going to change the picture in 60 years?
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. I mean, in 60 years' time, about 3.5 billion people will be Africans, a quarter of the planet. So it's a huge question about what we do moving forward. In terms of food, food availability, food quality, food choice, ultimately these are as much political decisions as any other. Hunger is a result of political inaction as much as it is about shortage of food, or more than it is about shortage of food. It might not be overt, but it's definitely there. I think we need to embrace technology. We talked about blockchain, we talked about artificial intelligence, all of those things, and indeed embrace technology that we don't yet have and don't yet know about and haven't taken on board. I think again in relation to the quality issue, we definitely have to be thinking green, we have to be thinking about sustainability, and we have to be thinking about local markets as much as we do about, or more than we do about exporting. And then, the thing I mentioned earlier, the last thing I'll mention is let's all stop wasting food. Yep. So my big idea, which is a very sexy idea, is that everybody in the world has to download an app which has my voice on it. And every time you waste an apple, an orange, a pineapple, a piece of meat, my voice comes up and says, stop wasting food.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how many of you want Graham's voice in your ear every day.
It's compulsory.
But the ideas are strong and powerful. Wastage has to be front and center of the conversation. So our time is officially up. I did make a promise to my panelists. I promised them that even as Max comes up, we're going to end this in a fun and sexy way. We're continuing on the sexy note that Graham has introduced. And so what we're going to do is I want my panelists to imagine that tomorrow, in the New African, the leading story is going to be about the future of food in Africa. And I would like you to help the editorial team by giving them the headline that they're going to run with when it comes to the story. And all I need you to do is start with the following phrase, the future of food in Africa, and then you complete the sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not asking for an executive summary. I am not asking for a paragraph. I'm asking for one line, the future of food in Africa. And then we'll hand over to Max. All right, so you always look like you're ready to go. So I'm going to start off with you. So ladies and gentlemen, let's listen in. The future of food for Africa. Go ahead, Mr. Hussein.
The future of food for Africa will matter immensely. It will have to be climate smart. It will have to be tailored for and engineered by women.
Okay,
and
this is where we say second take. We've got to do a second take. Now, the editor will not approve. I can guarantee you, sir. What we need is one line. It has to be the thing that's going less than 10 words, one line, the future of food.
For Africa, will have to be climate smart.
Ladies and gentlemen, the future of food in Africa will have to be climate smart. Let's give him a round of applause. Well done, Mr. Hussein. All right, Diane, let's come to you. The future of food.
The future of food in Africa is about abundance, prosperity, and sustainability.
It's about abundance, prosperity, and sustainability. Round of applause. Well done, Diane. For a banker, she didn't do too badly. In the creative space. Well done. So let me come to you, Madam. The future of food.
The future of food in Africa begins by harnessing giving in Africa. Giving in Africa is our next liberation. Not the gun, not the ballot, but giving.
The editor, are we going to approve? So the editorial team says no. So
one giver, one community at a time.
One giver, one community at a time. Let's give her a round of applause. Well done, madam. All right, so the future of food in Africa.
The future of food in Africa depends on a stable planet, or there will be no future.
The future of food in Africa depends on stable planning.
A stable planet.
Oh, depends on a stable planet, or there will be no future. Very strong words. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you very much. All right, Graham, you have the big job of closing this off with the big headline, the future of food in Africa.
Depends on us.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's how we close the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nozi, and the panel for such an engaging panel. Now, it's my pleasure, I have a pleasure and I have a duty. First, the pleasure. It's my pleasure to announce that the future of food in this hall is in the pavilion as we're breaking for lunch. And then also, I have to announce also that there's been a slight change to the schedule. We're moving a session that was originally programmed for tomorrow to this afternoon after lunch. And that's going to be this session, Guarding Africa's Gates, Protecting its Water Lanes and the Blue Economy. That will now take place instead of tomorrow, this afternoon, after lunch. If you can please try and be back in the room in time so that we can start the session at 2 p.m. Until then, enjoy your lunch. Yeah, I was confused.
mwese mukomeje kurikira televiziyo y'u Rwanda munyemerero tubagezeho ko umunsi wa mbere mu ncamake w'inama ya KUSI Ideas Festival iteraniye hano i Kigali ugenze. Inama rero ya KUSI Idea Festival akaba ari inama iteraniye bwa mbere mu gihugu cy'u Rwanda. Ni inama rero ihuriza hamwe inaribonye kuno mugabane barebera hamwe imbogamizi cyangwa se inzitizi umugabane wa Afrika ufite muri rusange, ariko banarebera hamwe amahirwe uno mugabane ufite mu gihe cy'imyaka 60 iri imbere. Ushobora kwibaza ese byabihuriye n'isoko rusange rya Afrika, birumvikana bigomba gukorana ko birebera hamwe cyangwa se bireba cyane cyane ibihugu bya Afrika muri rusange. Ino KUSI Idea Festival ni inama itegurwa na societe y'itumanaho ikomeye ku mugabane wa Afrika yitwa NMG cyangwa se Nation Media Group, aho ifite ibitangazamakuru bitandukanye, ariko by'umwihariko ikaba ifite n'ishoramari rikomeye mu ngeri zitandukanye, mu buzima, mu burezi, mu bijyanye n'ibikorwa remezo, ariko n'itangazamakuru ko afite ibitangazamakuru yaba ibyandika ndetse ibyo kuri internet ndetse na televiziyo n'amaradiyo bitandukanye muri Afrika y'Iburasirazuba, ibitangazamakuru bigera kuri 14. Ikaba yarashinzwe rero, NMG yashinzwe mu 1959, uno munsi kabiri mu kweziza isabukuru y'imyaka 60 kuva yashingwa n'umuherwe Aga Khan. Uno munsi rero usibye kwiziza isabukuru y'imyaka 60 NMG imaze, hakaba hagiye no gutangizwa ku mugaragaro noneho ikitwa ngo ni KUSI Idea Festival. Ni ibitekerezo bigiye gurizwa hamwe n'inaribonye n'abahanga kuno mugabane barebera hamwe ese umugabane wa Afrika mu myaka 60 iri imbere ni mugabane ki, ni mugabane uzaba ufite yihe shusho. Nanone tuributse ko ino KUSI ubwayo rikaba ari ijambo rituruka ku bucuruzi bwakorwaga mu binyejana byatambutse, mu binyagihumbi byatambutse, aho yakorwaga ku nyanja y'Ubuhinde, mu majyaruguru y'inyanja y'Ubuhinde, aho ubwo bucuruzi bwakorwaga hagati y'ukwezi kwa 4 ndetse no kugeza mu kwezi kwa 9 mo hagati. Bamaraga amezi 6 bakora ubwo bucuruzi, ariko mu buryo bwa gakondo, aho bafataga amezi yandi nyuma yaho ngaho habaga umuhengeri mwinshi cyane mu nyanja, bakabanza no bagacuruza neza iyo bafite bakabizana mu karere ka Afrika y'Iburasirazuba. Ibi byatumye bahuza umubano hagati y'ibi bihugu bya Afrika ndetse na Aziya, by'umwihariko mu bijyanye n'ubuhahirane. Byanatumye none habaho gusangira imico itandukanye y'Abanyafrika ndetse n'abandi, ariko ubwo buryo bwose bwari buryo gakondo. Muri kino kinyejana cya 21 uno munsi ubwo bucuruzi ntabwo ari bukigezweho, kuko dore ko ino nyanja y'Abahinde ari namwanyuzwa umurongo mugari wa internet yitwa ngo ni broadband. Bikaba byatumye buno bucuruzi buhindura isura, buba noneho ubucuruzi bw'umwuga hifashishijwe ikoranabuhanga. Bararebera hamwe none ni gute no mugabane ufite amahirwe menshi cyane, amahirwe asaga miliyari ushobora kubyazwa umusaruro. Ibyo nibyo byagarutsweho uno munsi, cyangwa se n'incamake igaragaza ino KUSI aho yaturutse. Uno munsi natwababwira ko NMG usibye kuba ari cyo gitangazamakuru cyangwa se cyo kigo gikomeye cya kabiri muri Afrika mu bijyanye n'itumanaho, nanone bakaba batangije uno munsi iyo myaka 60 iri imbere Afrika izabigana, ariko nanone bikajyanishwa cyangwa se bigasanishwa n'imyaka isaga 60 ibihugu bya Afrika bimaze bivuye mu gihe cy'ubukoloni. Bakavuga ngo ni ibintu bihuriranye, ariko by'umwihariko bifite aho biganisha Afrika. Mu byagarutsweho cyane by'umwihariko bareberaga hamwe ibibazo Afrika ifite mu kugira ngo yihaze mu biribwa. Ati ubutaka bugera kuri 63% butuye isi bwose usanga muri Afrika ariho buri budakoreshwa, bagasanga buramutse bukoreshejwe bwahaza Afrika muri rusange, kandi Afrika nigire ikibazo cy'inzara, kandi nacyo cyakomeje garukwaho muri pano yabanje mu biganiro. Dr. Donald Kaberuka yagaragaje ko byibura nk'ibigori bihingwa ku mugabane wa Afrika, ubutaka buhingwa byonyine byibura bishobora kwikuba inshuro zirindwi, ku buryo Afrika ishobora no gusagurira amasoko mpuzamahanga. Nanone bagaragaje kusire ko ino 33 15% y'ubutaka isi ifite ariko budakoreshwa tusanga ku mugabane wa Afrika basanze harimo n'ikibazo cya politike y'ibihugu aho ibihugu usanga bidafite ubushake bwa politike kugira ngo bafashe abaturage bivane mu bukene. None bagaragaza ko Afrika uno munsi ikoresha hafi miliyari zigera kuri 35 z'amadolari y'amanyafrika y'amanyamerika mbabarire. Izi miliyari n'amafaranga menshi cyane bavuga ko uno munsi ari Afrika ari ikoresha itumiza ibiryo hanze, bagasanga harimo gap cyangwa se ikinyuranyo kinini cyane hagati y'ubutaka budakoreshwa bungana 35% ariko bakanarenzaho miliyari zisaga 35 z'amadolari arizo z'ibiryo bitumizwa byinjira kuno mugabane. Bagasanga biramutse icyo cyuho kivuye mu gihe cy'imyaka 60 iri imbere byibura ko Afrika ishobora byibura igize nta kintu ikoze uno munsi. Muri 2025 Afrika yagitumiza byibura ibiribwa bigera kuri miliyari 110 z'amadolari buri mwaka. Ibi ni imbogamizi rero babona ko umugabane wa Afrika uno munsi ifite. Nanone bakaba bagaragaje ko Afrika uno munsi igize 15% y'abatuye isi, ndetse nanone ugasanga bagize 25% 15% abagize abaturage batuye isi yose. Ariko muri 15 igiteye impungenge cyangwa se igiteye inkeke cyane cyane usanga indwara nyinshi cyane ziri ku mugabane wa Afrika, aho 25% byibura ku ijana by'abatuye ino si abenshi bafite indwara zidakira, indwara nyinshi cyane usanga ku mugabane wa Afrika. Bagasanga uno munsi kuba Afrika igifite inkunga y'amahanga atari ikibazo, ahubwo ni imikoreshereze y'iyo nkunga. Aho ugasanga inkunga cyangwa se mu kwihaza kwa Afrika mu bijyanye n'umusaruro mbumbe w'ibihugu bya Afrika uno munsi ibihugu bigenda byihaza, ariko ikibazo gisigaye nuko ibihugu byinshi bitera inkunga Afrika usanga ari mu buzima. Ubuzima none bagasanga ko ari challenge cyangwa se n'ibogamizi ikomeye cyane, ikomeye no mugabane ko ya myaka 30 ba launching cyangwa se launching no munsi ko byagorana kugerwaho mu gihe ntangamba zifashwe. None bakagaragaza none ko muri 2035 byibura Afrika yo munsi y'ubutayu bwa Sahara niyo izaba ifite abaturage bakiri bato cyane bafite byibura imyaka iri hagati ya 15 na 64. Bakavuga ngo aya ni amahirwe kuko abenshi batanze urugero rwo mu Buyapani usanga abantu benshi cyane population nini iri hejuru y'imyaka 100 bona batagifite ingufu zo gukora. Bati kuba umugabane wa Afrika uzaba ugifite abantu benshi cyane bagifite ingufu zo gukora na amahirwe, ahubwo ni gute noneho amahirwe ashobora kubyazwa umusaruro. Bakagaragaza ko muri 2025 umujyi wa Lagos muri Nigeria ari umujyi uzaba utuwe cyane, uzaba n'umujyi munini cyane ku isi. Bakavuga none se kuba ari umujyi mwiza uzaba ari n'umujyi munini cyane ku isi bishobora gufasha iki Afrika? Ese no kurebera gusa kugira ngo abaturage bumve ko byibura bishimiye icyo kintu cyangwa bagomba no kwibyaza umusaruro? Byose nibyo bagomba kurebera hamwe mu nama igomba kumara iminsi 2 hano mu gihugu cyacu cy'u Rwanda. Inama yitabiriwe n'abantu basaga 800 baturutse hirya no hino kuno mugabane, ariko by'umwihariko uno munsi nabwo dutegereje ko umukuru w'igihugu cy'u Rwanda aza gutangiza ku mugaragaro ino nama yitwa KUSI Idea Festival, aho imyaka 30 iri imbere Afrika izaba ari Afrika imeze gute. Tuyibutsa ko siye gutangiza imyaka 30 iri imbere uno munsi NMG Ngino Societe yateguye ino nama, nayo uno munsi maze imyaka 30 ishinzwe kuko yashinzwe mu 1959. RBA hafi yawe turakubereye kugira ngo tuze kugezaho ino minsi 2 izaba imeze gute. Ese hazavamo iki, hazafatwamo izihe ngamba zizafasha uno mugabane wa Afrika kugira ku ntego zayo? Mukomeze munogerwe na gahunda zose Televiziyo Rwanda yabateguriye.